For the best in metaphysical, spiritual, and holistic programming, you're listening to InnerlightRadio.com, the healing frequency.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. And because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. If you're interested in freedom, you need some judo, you need some karate, you need all the things that will help you fight for freedom. Nationalism is the wave of the present and the future. It is nationalism that's bringing freedom to oppressed people all over the world. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Algerians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Nigerians and to the Ghanaians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the people of Uganda and Tanganyika and Sudan and Somaliland. The Africans didn't get it by sitting in. They didn't get it by waiting in. They didn't get it by singing "We Shall Overcome." They got it through nationalism. And you and I will get it through nationalism. What is it? What is it that makes it difficult for the philosophy of nationalism to spread among the so-called Negroes? Number one, they think they have a stake in America. They think they have an investment in this country, which we do. We invested 310 years of slave labor, 310 years, every day of which your and my mother and father worked for nothing. Not 8 hours a day. There was no union in that day. They worked from sun up until sundown, from can't see in the morning until can't see at night. They never had a day off. And on Sunday, they were allowed to sit down and sing about when they died, they wouldn't be slaves no more. When they died, they wouldn't be slaves no more. They'd go up in the sky, and every day would be Sunday. That's a shame. And it is that 310 years of slave labor that went in, that was my and your contribution into this particular economy and political system. They can give us the back pay. Let's join in. If this is what the Negro wants, let's join him. Let's show him how to struggle. Let's show him how to fight. Let's show him how to bring about a real revolution. Let's make him stop jiving. You don't need a debate. You don't need a filibuster. You need some action.
Blessings. This is Priestess HetHeru RaatMwt. Join me as I examine and explore the unfolding age of Aquarius culminating in year 2039 and its global impact on the consciousness of humanity. Join me with my very special guest as we remove the veil of death and destruction and its propaganda machinery for disempowerment. Join us as we deflate its power, providing healing solutions and methodologies for liberation and the cultural framework for the restoration of Ma'at within us and on this earth. Join us.
Resurrection Time, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, starting Tuesday, January 9th.
Higher consciousness. Let's go higher in our consciousness. consciousness. Let's go higher. The time's come for me to change the way I think, to change the way I feel, for me to go beyond what everybody thinks, what everybody says is real. Today I take a step into a time and space of peace and possibility, and here I'm gonna stay until I find my place, my true divinity. Higher consciousness. Let's go higher, higher in our consciousness. Let's go higher, higher consciousness. Let's go higher, come on, in our consciousness. Let's go higher. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with just one step, one idea. I'm moving on, not knowing what is coming next. I'm getting close, I'm getting near to a part of me that touches everything. Uniting
Okay.
all reality.
Peace and blessings,
Between what earth
and welcome to Resurrection Time. I'm your hostess, Priestess HetHeru RaatMwt. And this is actually a REZURRECTION show. I've been with Innerlight Radio for many years, and I'm returning to do this work with you and our global family. And I'm so grateful to be here. I'd like to actually do a tribute to one of my mentors, who this show is really going to be for. And his name was Ilambe Brath. And I just want to share a little bit about him, because it was through Ilambe that I was awakened, really was saved from the colonial mentality, was really saved from mental slavery. When I met him, I was really deaf, dumb, and blind, as they say. And so he was one of my first mentors, and I call him my political father. And I met him many, many moons ago in New York, in New Paltz, at SUNY New Paltz, which I attended in terms of the college that I went to. And he introduced me to so many African people, Pan-Africans, who really awakened me, such as Kwame Ture, who he would bring up to my school, and many other people that he introduced me to, activists and revolutionaries. And I'm just so grateful for his presence in my life as I was going through my journey of learning who I was and understanding the world scene, understanding, the geopolitics as it pertains to the African continent, and really understanding who I was as an African, which is why I opened up the show with El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, who was also one of my first teachers. So I just want to share a little bit about Ilambe, who made his transition to the ancestral plane on May 19, 2014. He was a Pan-African activist, and he's best known for founding the Patrice Lumumba Coalition. And he was very influential as an activist. He was recognized by Stokely Carmichael as the Dean of Harlem Nationalists, and by Dudley Thompson as an icon of the Pan-African movement. He made his transition again May 19, 2014 at the age of 77. Ilambe founded the Patrice Lumumba Coalition with Irvin Davis in 1975. And the Patrice Lumumba Coalition supported the right to self-determination for Angolans, South Africans, Namibians, and other African liberation movements. The coalition released a policy memo calling for the support of the Zimbabwe Liberation Army, and they garnered attention for a 1977 boycott in which they produced a Broadway musical called EST.Tune that dealt with apartheid in South Africa. Brath was also the host of a radio show on WBAI in New York called Africa Kaleidoscope, and he also was the founder of a campaign that dealt with Black Pride, in which he produced Afrocentric fashion shows. And they had a network of sisters who were called the Grandassa Models, and they were known to sport their large afros and African beautiful gear. And I just wanted to share a little bit about Ilambe because he was so central in my political development as I was making my way on my journey. Some of his influences were Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Carlos Cook, and his cousin Cleno Wickman, who was also an activist and was very instrumental in working to free the people of Barbados in the movement that they had there. So I just wanted to open up with that tribute. And now I'd like to introduce my guest today, who is a fantastic brother that I was able to be blessed to come across his work. And he's been doing some phenomenal work. Brother Rutendo Matinyarare. And brother, are you there with us, Hotep?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today from South Africa. And this brother is actually from Zimbabwe, and he's going to share with our Inner Light family a little bit about his work and what is happening in Zimbabwe, some of the unfoldments, and really try to explain to us some of the things that we might have questions about, or give us more insight into the political nature of what is unfolding. We know that Robert Mugabe, who was the president of Zimbabwe for 37 years, recently was ousted and then resigned. And we have now the vice president, Onanagwa, who is the president of Zimbabwe after his resignation. And we want to just get more insight into what is taking place. And the brother has produced some very amazing videos and is doing some profound work in the community in South Africa and Zimbabwe. So we wanted to bring him on to share a little bit about his work and his insight into the nature of the political unfoldments. Can you share a little bit about yourself, brother, first introducing the community to you and who you are and what is it that you are doing in terms of Zimbabwe at this time?
All right. It's unfortunate that we always have to use the scriptures that we've been given by our colonizers. So I do begrudgingly say that I am a Zimbabwean, but quite frankly, I would like to more say that I'm an African. And so happens, and sadly so happens, that I am an African living in a continent that is supposedly free, but still divided by colonial borders. But I'm living in South Africa. I got an opportunity to leave Zimbabwe to come to South Africa at an early age when I wasn't yet wise enough to understand what I was coming or getting into. I got an opportunity to come and do modeling in South Africa, modeling and film. And when I got here, I was shocked to find out that I was living in Europe, so to speak. A Europe in which Europeans rule over the natives, so to say. And nothing has changed between the colonial period of apartheid and the way that people are still living in South Africa. They've got freedoms to move freely, freedoms to vote, but at that young age, I started to understand that it's no point having the power to vote, no point in having a constitution that sounds like it is very equitable if you're not able to access it because of economic problems or economic restrictions. And only then that I began to become conscious enough to start to read about the history, not only of South Africa, but the history of Zimbabwe. Finding out that what we had been taught in our education system had nothing to do with the history of our people or the history of our oppression. And it is when I started doing that reading and establishing that we were a very subjugated people who actually have a colonial history, who don't know our own roots and where we come from, that I started speaking. I started speaking a lot on social media. I also started awakening to the fact that this oppression would never end until we start self-determining, until we start producing for self, until we start owning our factors of production, and until we get to an extent or a point of being able to self-determine. That is also when I started to understand the logic, understand the message that Robert Mugabe had been sending for a greater part of my youthful life. By the time that I came to South Africa was about the time that Zimbabwe had started taking its land back. And because of the upbringing, because of the parental influence, we all felt that Mugabe taking land was insanity. We all felt that it was going to bring the economy into, I'm looking for the word, was going to crash the economy. And indeed, when he did take the land, there were sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. With those sanctions, there was the externalization of capital from Zimbabwe by the previous colonial masters or the colonial class. And guess what? Black business people that had been created by Mugabe's indigenization policies also started to externalize their money to run to the very same capitals that were our colonial capitals. So indeed, the economy did crash, and it all seemed like it was an omen without us recognizing that, no, it was sabotage. It was a design. It was a colonial design to make our economy crash. And that's when I really started speaking out. And fortunately for social media platforms like Facebook, we're able to have a voice, even on a platform that belongs to people that don't want us to have a voice. And we are saying, as long as that platform still is open, as long as that platform still gives us an ability to speak to the African mind, we're going to use it until it blocks us. And when it blocks us, hopefully,
Let me just ask you this. You said that you're from Zimbabwe and you moved to South Africa. What was some of the things that led up to that? Was that just for your career, or was that some of the conditions that were going on there? And if so, explain some of that to us as well.
What is interesting is by the time that I left Zimbabwe, I actually didn't want to leave Zimbabwe. I was happy. I was okay. But a number of things had happened in my own personal life that had led me to leave for South Africa. So number one, my first job, I got a job as a marketing assistant manager for a company that was doing office machinery and furniture. Being a 19-year-old, this was my first job, given a company car, a company cell phone, and basically building myself up to actually see myself in a different position in a few years, maybe as a director of marketing in the very same company. Crashed my car. After crashing my car, got fired. And I believe that I got fired because my marketing manager didn't have the qualifications that I had, so he felt that I was a threat for his job. And then I got into another job for a tire company that used to sell truck tires, haulage tires, that is. So on that very same job, my girlfriend at the time had an uncle who was the biggest client of the business. The business was owned by a white gentleman. The trucking company or the haulage company was owned by a black guy. And he was one of the biggest customers, but not only was one of the biggest customers, he also had the biggest debt in the company. Anyway, to cut a long story short, there was tires being stolen at work. I broke up with my girlfriend after finding out that she was cheating on me. My girlfriend went to tell her uncle, who was friends with my boss, that I was the person that was behind stealing the tires. And so I got fired. And after getting fired, if you get a reputation of being a thief in a company, and then the reputation goes around in the country to the biggest or the best human resources agencies, it becomes very difficult for you to get a job. And I remember at the time I was in line for...
Okay, I think we have a caller, and I don't... we haven't opened for callers yet. Maybe that caller can call back. We have about over an hour for the show. We just want the brother to be able to share a little bit. But thank you so much, whoever that is that's trying to call in. If you can please call back just in a few minutes, maybe within half an hour, so the brother can cover some of the history. Brother, what I was trying to gauge you with there was if you can share with the Innerlight family, what the political and economic situation was looking like, because they're at that time of your life, because I know there's been a lot of challenges that Zimbabwe was dealing with in terms of the sanctions that were imposed, which caused a lot of the youth to, move to South Africa and to other places. If you can, really give some insight into, the impact that was taking place in terms of Zimbabwe, and how, that really caused, not just your person, but many youth to have to engage in employment outside of their home.
Yeah, I do understand that we're on a radio show and we need to be quick. But what I was trying to do by telling you that story, I was trying to create the context that when I left Zimbabwe, it was not because of the economic conditions, but it was the personal conditions that had been created in my life that made it impossible for me to get re-employed in Zimbabwe. So the reputation of having been a thief, which I hadn't been, is what made me need to look for opportunities outside Zimbabwe for me to get a job, because I was not going to get a job in Zimbabwe as a thief. So anyway, I left Zimbabwe to come to South Africa under the context that I created, not because of economic problems, because at the time in 1999 when I left, the economic conditions were still fine. I need to also qualify that even after I left, the economic conditions being bad was always a perception more than a reality. Why do I say that? By the time that Mugabe took land, by the time that Mugabe took the resources of the nation, including the mineral resources, it gave black Zimbabweans a greater opportunity to participate in the economy and actually make money more than we ever had before. But because of our mindset, because of our upbringing, because of our indoctrination, we actually did not realize that there was an opportunity that had opened up. For those that recognized this as opportunity, they stayed in Zimbabwe. For those that did not recognize it as an opportunity, because of the education system that Zimbabweans had been given, they found it as a key to leave the country and go and get employment outside the country. When they did that, they found themselves working in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, but, for instance, in the United Kingdom, they were stuck in certain pigeonholes of the jobs that they could do. And one of the major jobs that Zimbabweans in England can do is to become nurses. And the other one is to become factory workers. Those that were qualified, those that had degrees in accounting, marketing, and a whole lot of other specialized professions could not get employment and found it very difficult to get employment. I had a brother of mine that left Zimbabwe. He went through to the United Kingdom with an MBA. He could not use the MBA in England. He had to work in factories and a lot of times had to be redundant. So this is why I'm trying to create the context to try and say to you, a lot of people saw the economic problems in Zimbabwe or the downturn that had been caused by white investment leaving the country as a problem and left and went outside the country only to become slaves.
We're not postulating that, but what I was trying to get some clarity on was recently Managwa, when he went to South Africa, he was calling back many of those people who had left And so that's why I was making that statement, but not in terms of the Western propaganda. That wasn't intention at all. That's not what our work is about here. But if you could really share a little bit more information about, actually, if we could maybe go forward a little bit about what is unfolding now in Zimbabwe in terms of this new initiative that Managua is unfolding for Zimbabwe.
What is happening now is the perpetuation of the same narrative that I was trying to deconstruct now, which I know you were not trying to pick. But basically, it's Mnangagwa saying to the world that Zimbabwe has failed. And because Zimbabwe has failed, Zimbabwe needs the assistance of the West to come back on track. Mm-hmm. And obviously, when he says that, what he is trying to say is that he wants the West's economic sanctions to be removed from Zimbabwe. And the context of the economic sanctions that have been put by the West are very important to outline for people to understand why Zimbabwe is in the position that it's in, where there's economic stagnancy, where there is no foreign currency, and when the country doesn't have its own currency. And all that is because of the economic sanctions that were imposed, firstly by the United States government, something called ZIDERA of 2001, or in fact, ZIDERA of 2002, and it is the ZIDERA Act in which the Congress of the United States decided to institute sanctions on Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. So those sanctions have had an effect and an impact on Zimbabwe. But a lot of Zimbabweans don't even know that their country is on sanctions. Because when the United States government imposed these sanctions, they said that the sanctions were targeting ZANU-PF officials and was stopping them from traveling to the United States and undertaking business with the United States. That was what the United States government was saying. That was what the United States embassy in Harare was saying. However, when you do look at the document of ZIDERA Act, it's called S494, it says something totally different. It basically says that Zimbabwe took land illegally and did not recognize property rights in Zimbabwe, and took land from people, doesn't stipulate that it's white Rhodesians, it's colonizers, but it just says people, and therefore took that land illegally, and therefore that's one of the reasons why the sanctions were instituted. Another reason why the sanctions were instituted, it says, is because Zimbabwe undertook a war in Congo. Now, you have to understand that Congo, since Mobutu Sese Seko, has been a colony, protectorate, or a place of interest for the United States. And because of that, they took off, they put Mobutu Sese Seko and killed Patrice Lumumba so that Mobutu Sese Seko could carry out United States interests. Mm-hmm. We fast forward to a period where Mobutu Sese Seko was really damaging the country. He got overthrown by someone called Laurent Kabila. Laurent Kabila overthrew him with rebels, but the rebels were coming from Rwanda and Uganda. And because of that, when he got into power, those two sides, or those rebels that were being pushed by Uganda and Rwanda, wanted positions in his military. Now, I think it's common sense that you cannot have a military force that is basically manned by foreigners or foreign generals. So obviously Kabila refused, and when he refused, those rebels were pushed by Uganda and Rwanda to go in and attack and try and remove Kabila from power. Kabila appealed to Mugabe, together with what we call SADC, Southern African Development Commission, to bring in their troops to defend him from the rebels that wanted to overthrow him. The policy of SADC at the time was that there was going to be mutual defense for any nation that went under attack, the same way that NATO has. They had the same agreement in Southern Africa that any nation that goes under attack from rebel forces or an outside power shall be defended by the rest. Other nations, like South Africa, had just gotten independence, were lobbied by we don't know who not to participate. So 3 nations from SADC agreed to go and help Congo. That was Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola. So when they went in there, they stopped the rebels from overthrowing Kabila. This did not sit well with the Western nations because, number one, they felt that countries like Zimbabwe had begun to show arrogance to try and fight imperial interests in Africa with their own militaries. And so that was one of the reasons why they put sanctions, and why Zidera thought it important to put sanctions on Zimbabwe, is to actually destroy or attenuate that power and self-assertion that countries like Zimbabwe were beginning to express. Finally, the United States government then said, because of Zimbabwe going into Congo, there was financial mismanagement where its priorities were misaligned. Instead of serving its people's interests, it decided to go into Congo to defend Congo. So therefore, that was mismanagement of finances. They were going to stop the IMF, and they were going to stop any other international multilateral organizations on the continent or in the globe from lending money to Zimbabwe. And they were also then going to stop any cancellation of previous debt on Zimbabwe to take place in the dispensation of the sanctions. Now, this would obviously affect any nation in the world. If you remember, the American government will take any country that doesn't want to use the US dollar to war. Now, imagine they had just made sure that a small little country like Zimbabwe was unable to get debt, was unable to get the cancellation of even colonial debt, because when Zimbabwe got independence, it had to take over the debt of the colonial government. And if you remember or understand, that debt was accrued in buying weapons to stop Zimbabweans or black Zimbabweans from fighting for independence. Mm-hmm. So that is the context of what caused Zimbabwe to be where it is. And so when Mnangagwa is saying he wants a re-engagement with the West, what he's basically asking for is for the 17-year-old sanctions to be removed by the United States and our partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. You were dispelling some myths, Western propaganda, in that presentation. And one of the myths that has been circulating has been about the massacre that they say took place in South Africa from 1983 to 1987. If you could enlighten our family as well on the war that was actually unfolding there, and dispel that myth as well, because I think a lot of people have heard that, and they were influenced by that propaganda as well.
Yeah, if it wasn't for the fact that you had given me context, had you said to me in this conversation, talk to me about the massacre, I probably wouldn't have known what you were referring to. Because I am not really aware of a massacre, but I am aware of a war that took place after we finished our liberation struggle. And the war basically took place between two of the political parties and two of the militia or armed movements that ushered in our independence. So for us to get our independence, there were two sides that formed military wings. One was called ZAPU and the other was called ZANU-PF. These two political parties and military wings were divided very loosely around tribal lines. ZANU-PF being more aligned with the majority Shona, and ZAPU being more aligned to the minority ZAPU. Now, the tribal division was not because those were the policies of the two parties or the two military divisions, but it was because of the leaders of those parties. The leader of ZAPU was Ndebele, not exactly Ndebele, but a tribe aligned to the Ndebeles called Kalanga. And so Ndebeles aligned more readily with him. And then Shona Party was headed by Robert Mugabe. But why I say that it was loosely tribal is that the leader that was there before Robert Mugabe at ZANU was actually Ndebele as well. His name was Ndabaningi Sithole. But he got removed in the fact that he started to cooperate with the colonial government and the South African apartheid government and the Zambian leader, Kenneth Kaunda, to try and force the fighting forces to negotiate with the colonial government for some form of a shared government agreement. Now, ZAPU and ZANU, which had ZIPRA and ZANLA as their fighting forces, all didn't agree with this. However, Kenneth Kaunda was being given some form of appeasement by the South African government, together with Ian Smith, that was pushing him to try and negotiate these parties from fighting to negotiating with the colonial settlers. But there was also pressure, ironically, from Henry Kissinger. So the Americans had vested interest in that terrain and also wanted to see a negotiated settlement which would give a semblance of democracy that was not true democracy, because it would give white people, who were 4% of the population, a 51% veto in parliament. Mm-hmm. But anyway, these tribal divisions resulted in a situation where, when independence came, Robert Mugabe was voted in, coming from ZANU, as the leader of Zimbabwe. We believe that the British government tried to take advantage of the tribal differences between ZANU and ZAPU, or the perceived tribal differences between ZANU and ZAPU, and incited the ZAPU, let me call them fundamentalists, or Ndebele fundamentalists, to try and kick out the ZANU government. And this was being done underpinned by a history that was 160 years old, where there were tribal divisions and warfare between the ZAPU, between the Ndebeles and the Shonas. And this tribal infighting, or tribal fighting, that was historical before the colonialists got here, is what the British tried to take advantage of. So because Ndebeles were back in the day, before the colonialists got here, were a strong tribal force, they were warriors, they came directly from Shaka, Zulu, as a warring division that was separated from Shaka because of disputes between Shaka and the leader of the Ndebeles. The name Ndebele only came along the way from running from Shaka's Mufekani, that they called themselves the Ndebeles and settled in Zimbabwe. Their settlement in Zimbabwe displaced a lot of Shonas, and this is where enmity came from. The British took that history and said to the Ndebeles, you cannot be ruled by Shonas. And because you cannot be ruled by Shonas, you should definitely fight to overthrow the Shonas. The British obviously dispute this, and then they pass it on to the Russians, who trained the ZAPU wing, or the Ndebele wing, while the Shona wing were trained by the Chinese. So the English tried to create a narrative that says that the Ndebeles were being pushed by the Russians to overthrow the Chinese-trained ZANU, so that they could be able to get repayment for all the assistance that they gave ZAPU in weapons and training to go to war with Ian Smith. We don't know what the truth is, but what we know is that the Ndebeles had guns at a time where there was supposed to be demobilization, at a time we're supposed to be having peace soon after independence, at a time where both sides, ZAPU and ZANU fighting forces, were supposed to be getting integrated into the new Zimbabwe army, which was still headed by Rhodesian military officers. There was supposed to be integration of the three factions. While trying to create these integrations, ZAPU and ZANU fighters were put into demobilization camps. In these demobilization camps, anyone who was a fighter had to come from wherever they were fighting from, come back into the country, go to a demobilization camp, give up their weapons, and then stay in the camp until they've been integrated into the army, or until they've been dismissed, or what you call it, debriefed to go back to live their civilian lives. In those camps is where ZAPU fighters rose up against their partner ZANU fighters. They had weapons that they had not demobbed. They had weapons that they had not handed in, and they used those weapons to fight their ZANU counterparts. And they did this in about 3 cities in the country, the 2 largest cities in the country, plus a smaller city in the middle of the country. This caused friction that started to divide the fighters according to tribal lines. The government did not want to see it as a tribal issue. They thought it was an issue of restlessness, so they needed to rush up the integration of these fighters from the bush into the military system. They tried to do that. They did that. And when these fighters got to military barracks and started getting trained, and that time training was happening under the British government and Australians, they started fighting each other in these barracks as well, according to their tribal lines and according to their political affiliations that were tribal. This again was dismissed by the government as something not to worry about. But eventually, in Matabeleland, which stands for Ndebele land, which is where the Ndebeles and a lot of the ZAPU supporters came from, they started to be uprisings where even tanks that were never used in the war all of a sudden came out of hiding. And now what Robert Mugabe didn't understand is that why was it that ZAPU, that never used any conventional weapons like tanks before, all of a sudden had tanks that were now being rolled into the country to overthrow a democratically elected government. That's when he also got messages from Zambia that not only did they have tanks, but there was 2 MiG jet fighters that were sitting in Zambia that the Russians had given to ZAPU, but were never used in the war. On further inquiry, it was then suggested that those jets were given to ZAPU not to use against the Rhodesians, but to actually use them only when independence came to take power from ZANU, which was known was going to win. So with this, Mugabe started to talk with the British government that said that a military unit had to be sent down to Matabeleland to quell this fighting, to quell this unrest before it actually turned into a revolt or actually some form of a rebellion. Mugabe created a force that was made up of police officers that were sent down to Matabeleland, but they failed to bring an end to it. By this time, ZAPU fighters had started to kill white farmers, white missionaries, and all of a sudden, the British were not too concerned about what ZAPU was doing until ZAPU started to kill white people. The moment they started to kill white people, the police unit that had been sent down to Matabeleland was not good enough anymore. They actually decided to send the army. So on the advice of the British trainers and the British instructors that were in Zimbabwe, an army division was sent to Zimbabwe, to Matabeleland. That army division consisted of all 3 forces that were opposing each other or were divided in the war. The Rhodesian force, and there was some ZAPU soldiers and ZANU soldiers. They all went down to Matabeleland. When they got down to Matabeleland, the ZAPU forces went AWOL. They ran away from their divisions and they basically left with their weapons. So now, what was looking like a small little problem of a small number of ZAPU dissidents or delinquents in Matabeleland started to look like a planned dissertation and a planned move for ZAPU to separate itself from the National Army and actually form an opposition division. By this time, the South African government was involved in taking a certain number of ex-ZAPU military, taking them into South Africa, taking them into Botswana, and training them with South African funds, South African trainers, to create a rebel division that was supposed to come back into Zimbabwe and destabilize Zimbabwe. All this was happening while ZAPU soldiers were absconding or running away from the from the National Army. So when this happened, Mugabe started to have to look at this as ZAPU could be turning against the nation. All along it was suspicion. All along it was just deemed to be fracas that happens between groups that are just about to be integrated. But with the dissertation that happened, all of a sudden it began to look like it was planned. With the evidence of the MiG jets, with the evidence of the tanks that were now being rolled into cities, they started to see ZAPU as a potential threat. Mugabe then created a division that did not include any Ndebeles, that was sent again to Matabeleland to quell this problem and to fight military men that were now being armed coming in from South Africa. So a war took place from 1983 all the way to 1987 until ZANU and ZAPU decided to have an amnesty and an armistice and negotiate to form one party. Mm-hmm. So when people say this was a massacre, it is very tricky for some of us.
This is not people. It's actually Western propaganda, and it's something that's pretty much put out there, in the West, all over the media. So we wanted to clear that up so people wouldn't have a misunderstanding of what unfolded. Let's go forward a little to the current situations unfolding there. Could you give us some information about the development that took place in terms of what unfolded with Mugabe's ouster? And what maybe you can, again, create that same historical framework, what led up to that situation as well?
Well, with Robert Mugabe, major reason why he was ousted is because as he had become old, and a lot of people were feeling that it was time for him to step down. There were different wings of people, some who believed that he's too old, he needs to step down, but ZANU-PF itself had continued to punt Robert Mugabe as their leader. It continued to punt Mugabe as the leader that is going to stand for them in the 2018 elections that are happening this year. So there was division in ZANU-PF itself, with a certain part of ZANU-PF feeling that Mugabe must step down, and there was another division that was feeling that Mugabe must stay. But within the must stay camp, there was also two factions that created themselves in the must stay camp. A faction that was aligned with his wife, that wanted a younger group of people to take over from Mugabe. And it is perceived that Grace Mugabe herself wanted to be the person to succeed Mugabe. And if she did succeed Mugabe, she was going to bring in a younger group of people that were going to do away with the group of people that were liberation fighters that wanted to continue the governance of the country as ex-liberation fighters, because that was the promise that they made to each other with Mugabe in the bush, allegedly.
Okay, so could you share with our family some of the groups that you're speaking to? I know G40 and the war veterans. Could you expound on that a little bit so they can have a background on that?
So the other group was a group of war veterans, the people that had gone to war, people that were aligned to people that went to war, and people that basically said that when we went to war, we had a pact to agree that the country was always going to be run by people that went to war because they understood the price of going to war. The names of these two groups, the one that was aligned with Grace Mugabe was called G40. G40 basically talking about people that were around and about the generation of 40 years old. So we would talk about people between 40 and maybe at most 60, because Grace Mugabe herself is about 54. And then the other one was called Lacoste. And the reason it was called Lacoste is because the leader of that, which is Emerson Mnangagwa, was allegedly a member of a group called the Crocodile Gang. And the Crocodile Gang was a gang that sparked the liberation struggle in 1967. A group of young men driving in a car, 4 of them, got to a police roadblock manned by white police officers and a few black police officers. A fight ensued. They shot a white police officer called Oberhauser, and that was deemed to have been the start of the liberation of Zimbabwe, or at least the hot war. So within these two factions that had created themselves, Grace Mugabe started making great inroads into oustering any opposition that she had, so that she could be left as the only option to be elected in a conference that was going to happen in December as the vice president of Robert Mugabe. But there were already 3 vice presidents sitting there already. So Robert Mugabe went on, and Grace Mugabe together went on a purge to purge the vice presidents that were there. The first one to go was a lady called Joyce Mujuru. She was a vice president after her husband was the leading general who was in the liberation struggle. He got killed. After he got killed, soon after, she was ousted from her position as vice president. The next one was Emmerson Mnangagwa. And they went, made moves, got rid of Emmerson Mnangagwa through party processes, I'll have to say. So now what this meant is that Grace Mugabe was definitely going to ascend to become the next vice president in December 2017 conference. And this was not sitting well with a lot of people. I will have to admit that it didn't sit well with me too, because in as much as I liked Mugabe, in as much as I believed in the ideology of Mugabe, I did not necessarily believe that his wife carried the ideology that was supposed to take our country to the level that it was supposed to go. She was not presidential. She had failed to be a first lady during a dispensation over the past 27 years. She failed to be a first lady. She failed to take leadership. She failed to mother the nation. So I didn't believe that she had what it took. Some people even go to the extent of suggesting that the problem with Grace Mugabe is that Mnangagwa himself is the person that had gone to get Grace Mugabe, who was not in politics, to come and join politics. And they believe that Mnangagwa went to get Grace Mugabe to come into politics so that she could purge that the vice president that was there at the time, which was Joyce Mujuru, so that he could ascend to become the vice president. And he believed that if he had ascended to become vice president, he would actually succeed Mugabe. What he did not count on is Grace Mugabe coming in and starting to have political ambitions herself. So, with Grace Mugabe having political ambitions, with Grace Mugabe seeming to ascend to become the next vice president of the nation, the military could not take it. But before I say that the military could not take it, I have to actually say she wanted to purge the military of all those generals that had been in the army, because her idea and her ideology was to ensure that the government that was going to come after Robert Mugabe was gone was one that was devoid of ex-liberation fighters. Once that happened, and the moment she made a move to get rid of Emmerson Mnangagwa, she then made a move to get rid of the general of the army. They sent him to China first and foremost. When he came back from China, Emmerson Mnangagwa had been fired, so they sent him to China so that they could fire Emmerson Mnangagwa. And once they had done that, when he came back from China, they had at the airport police officers waiting to arrest him. Unfortunately for them, their secret had gone out. The secret had gone out that Grace Mugabe and Mugabe were going to try to arrest the general when he comes out, and with that was always going to be the fall of other generals and other leaders of other divisions in the military. So by the time the general got back, there were commanders waiting to escort him from the airport. His plane touched down. The police walked forward to try and arrest him. The commanders were wearing the same uniforms as the, what do we call it, aviation staff that works at the airport. And the moment that they tried to arrest the general, those aviation staff took off their overalls and showed their commander uniforms. They then took the general and left the airport with the general. And the police had to go back and report that they could not arrest the general. This is what caused the coup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to take a station break, and when we come back, we're going to open the phone lines for the Interlight family. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
For the best in metaphysical, spiritual, and holistic programming, you're listening to InnerlightRadio.com, the healing frequency.
Blessings. This is Priestess HetHeru RaatMwt. Join me as I examine and explore the unfolding age of Aquarius culminating in year 2039 and its global impact on the consciousness of humanity. Join me with my very special guest as we remove the veil of death and destruction and its propaganda machinery for disempowerment. Join us as we deflate its power, providing healing solutions and methodologies for liberation, and the cultural framework for the restoration of Ma'at within us and on this earth. Join us.
Resurrection Time, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, starting Tuesday, January 9th.
For the best in metaphysical, spiritual, and holistic programming, you're listening to InnerLightRadio.com, the healing frequency.
And welcome back to Resurrection Time. And this is your hostess, Priestess HetHeru RaatMwt, and we're being joined by Brother Rutendo from South Africa today, and he's sharing with the Inner Light family his vision of South Africa and the historical unfoldments that have taken place there. I would like to say thank you for joining me today, and that I am fasting, and my fast is really taking its toll today. I'm really doing some detoxing, so just bear with us in this journey. And thank you, Brother Jamal, for that wonderful music from South Africa by Yvonne Shaka Shaka. And that is a wonderful piece there. And so, Brother Rutendo, you were sharing about the development there in Zimbabwe and how we got to this point, right, where we are, and what has been unfolding in terms of the ZANU-PF party, which is what you were ending on there. Can you shed some more light for us in terms of Managwa and his position that we see there unfolding in terms of certain moves that he's been making, certain policies, and we've had a lot of questions. Some of us here in the West trying to understand what was going on there and exactly what reforms are unfolding, if any, or what position ZANU-PF is taking for the continuation of the revolutionary, struggle in the future.
Right. First of all, let me make a correction. That song was from Mafiki Zolo, not from Yvonne Shaka Shaka.
Oh, but, really? My producer said it was Yvonne Shaka Shaka.
No, it's Mafiki Zolo. So
did you bring that music today? Or Brother Jamal? I don't know. The Brother Jamal is there, but he shared with me we have a screen here. He said that was music from South Africa by Yvonne Shaka Shaka. So I'm just reading what he had there.
No problem.
Okay.
So, right.
Well, anyway, thank you for that, brother. So share with us a little more about what is taking place there, please.
So the issue that we have is that there is a lot of talk to say the reason why Mugabe wanted Grace Mugabe to ascend to power was because he did not have any trust in any of his lieutenants that were coming after him to keep the policies that he had and to keep the ideology that he had going. So there is talk that Mugabe already knew that Mnangagwa was very Western aligned. There is also understanding that Mugabe already understood that Mnangagwa was having conversations with the West, was in good stead with the West, and so therefore it's one of the major reasons why Mugabe wanted to get Grace Mugabe to ascend to maintain his ideologies. There are those of us who feel that Grace Mugabe herself was probably not the right person to maintain Mugabe's policies, but she would have only tried to maintain them by default just because she was hated by the West or because the West was not engaging her as the wife of Mugabe. The question that a lot of us have always asked is that if the West decided to engage her, if the West decided to say they were going to lift the sanctions, they were going to allow her to come shopping in New York, they were going to allow her to have free reign anywhere in the world, would she have accepted that kind of a move by the West, and would she have then held on to the principles of her husband? I am not too convinced that she would have. Okay. And the reason that I'm... Mm-hmm. Right, so these ideological differences between Mugabe and his lieutenants is what caused a great part of this division. And like I said and pointed out already, that Mnangagwa himself is deemed to have brought Grace Mugabe. So now, the thing that Mnangagwa started to do when he wanted to ascend to power was to say that there was a need for us to re-engage the West. There was a need for us to get investors and investment from the West. And when he did ascend to power, that is the very same thing, first thing that he said. And he also promised to reverse some of the pillar policies that Robert Mugabe had put in. He said that he would reverse the indigenization policy that says any foreign company that wants to do business in Zimbabwe has to have 51% shareholding of black Zimbabweans. And he was also going to reverse the concept that any business opportunities, any resources found in Zimbabwe will be given a first option to be given to Zimbabweans who can then partner with a foreigner or anybody coming from outside Zimbabwe on a 49-51% basis. He also said that he would give land or some of the land back to white farmers, and he would compensate those white farmers that lost their land for any developments that they did on the land. Obviously, this goes very much against the concept and the policy that Mugabe stood for, but it also goes against the doctrine of having gone for the liberation struggle. Because the liberation struggle was for the land that had been dispossessed of. What we don't understand is how Mnangagwa can today then reward or compensate white farmers for that land or any developments that are made on it, yet it was stolen property in the first place. in our law or legal system in Southern Africa, we generally use Roman Dutch law. There is an understanding that there is no enforcement of an illegality. If land is illegal, if property is stolen, nobody can make developments on that property and then hope to get compensation for those developments, yet those developments were never legal in the first place. We also have a problem with the concept of him compensating white farmers, yet when we won the war against Rhodesia, no reparations were paid to black Zimbabweans. No reparations were paid to Zimbabweans to bring them into restoration or restitution in integrum for the losses that had happened over the 100 years of colonization.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, that's very profound. You also wrote a letter to Managua and shared that in social media. Could you, in a synopsis, give us some insight into what you were trying to express?
What I tried to express in my letter is the very first thing that I said is I tried to give him context of the fight that is happening in the world for the minds and psyches of people to understand or see things from a certain perspective. And the way that I put that across to him was basically saying that I am in the advertising, marketing, and branding space. And in the advertising, marketing, and branding space, lots of times in countries like South Africa and many countries across the world, black executives, black advertising agencies are not given the ability to ascend up the ladder or to get jobs because the duty, responsibility of influencing minds of people, influencing the psyche and psychology of people is seen as the domain of whiteness. And a black person that ascends either has to be working for a white agency or he has to be in agreement with the white logic or white way of thinking. So I said to Mnangagwa, I believe that by him making the pronouncements that he has made ever since he's ascended into power, the pronouncements that says that they want white farmers to come back into Zimbabwe, despite the fact that last year Zimbabwe had a bumper harvest that superseded any other harvest of maize, even during the time that white farmers were in Zimbabwe. The fact that he says that he wants the white capital to come back to Zimbabwe is him feeding to the narrative that black people cannot develop without white people. I felt that he hadn't done enough to say to his people that they had done a good job and to say to his people that they needed to continue to be the first line of investment and the first line of development for Zimbabwe. I felt that he also had not reached out to the African continent and the African diaspora and African Americans to say that before we go and look for investment from the Americans, before we go and look for investment from the British, we need African Americans, the African diaspora, Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in Africa to be the first source of investment, the first people that we want to embrace as Africans, embrace as having a common interest with us, to come and invest in Zimbabwe. So by reaching out to the West first, by reaching out to the British first, by calling out to the Americans to say, we need your investment, we need you to open up New York stock exchange and funds from these New York and London, was him failing to communicate the importance of black people to build black nations for black benefit. I also felt that by him reaching out even to Japan and to Korea and to India and China was him failing to understand the structure of international capital, which is basically America colonizing the rest of the world and making them colonies by their funds. And I thought it was very important for me to point out in that very same letter that Japan might seem like a successful nation, but it is an American colony. And a lot of people doubt when I say that Japan is an American colony, but there are 54,000 U.S. troops on Japanese soil. There are 36 air bases that Americans land military aircraft that Japanese can never inspect to know what's on them. in the same way that the Koreans are also colonies of America and the way that Germany is a colony of America.
Yes. Well, I think that, you have very profound insight into that situation. And I haven't really heard that position very much. I think we need more critique as it pertains to the recent moves and policies that we see unfolding there. And it's a process, that Zimbabwe is going through. And so it's important that people articulate their understanding, their views, their position, so that there can be a better Zimbabwe in the future. What do you see for this upcoming election? And you can share the exact date for that as well with the family. And what do you see in terms of, I don't know if ZANU-PF is the only party that's going to be...
The elections are going to be interesting.
Yeah, also if you could, we have some noise coming from your side. Okay, that's better. Yeah.
The elections are going to be interesting, but no one can really foresee what is going to go on. The reason why we can't foresee what is going to go on is it's all going to depend on what are the compromises that are reached between Mnangagwa and the West. Now, I did say that Mnangagwa has promised to make certain changes to policies. He has already given the assertions of the type of changes that he's going to make. The problem now is that not only did
And exactly when is the election going to be?
I'm not too sure. I think August to September. Yeah, I don't think that the president has announced yet a date. But we're focusing on probably August to September. So Mnangagwa made his offers to the West, or his concessions. But it's very important to understand that he did not make those concessions for nothing. He has also made a demand, or what looked like simple demands. And the demand that he has given to the West is that he wants re-engagement. And he wants re-engagement, and that re-engagement will include him getting investment into Zimbabwe. So Western investment must come into Zimbabwe. For Western investment to come into Zimbabwe, one fundamental thing has got to happen from a legal perspective. The American sanctions and the European and British sanctions that are on Zimbabwe have to be removed. And once those are removed, there is no more restraining any American investor, any person that wants opportunity in Africa from coming to Zimbabwe. And so Mnangagwa has asked for that as the only condition. Now, if the Americans give Mnangagwa investment, Mnangagwa is going to be able to start making very big changes in Zimbabwe. And as a country that has been starved of foreign investment, a country that has been starved of foreign debt, because remember I said that debt and cancer, and I'm not giving Zimbabwe debt or access to international debt was one of the things that the sanctions did. It would mean that we would potentially have new debt, cancellation of old debt, and potentially new arrangements for debt made. I don't necessarily support it, but Mnangagwa could use this to his advantage. He could go after the low-hanging fruit, start developing the hospitals that are dilapidated, start developing the roads, and start developing the schooling system that was beginning to fall apart. All these would be things that the Zimbabwean public will notice very quickly. And they would notice them and they would emotionally impact them to the extent that they could potentially be forced or look at voting for Mnangagwa as a potential person to take Zimbabwe out of its doldrums. Number two, it would immediately show that the claim that Robert Mugabe has been making, that the sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union and the British is the reason why Zimbabwe is not doing well. So the narrative that Zimbabwe is not doing well because of ZANU-PF negligence and corruption would immediately go out the window. What this does is it collapses the whole stance and position of the Europeans and the Americans for the past 17 years. And it will also start to confirm to the Zimbabwean public that the Americans and the British and the Europeans put sanctions on Zimbabwe to settle a vendetta with Robert Mugabe. All this plays into making Mugabe look like a hero, and it plays into making Mugabe a winner. So the only other option is for the Europeans and the Americans to refuse to give Mnangagwa what he's looking for, and then ask Mnangagwa to first deliver on his concessions. So this means Mnangagwa has got to give land back to white people. He's got to make a negotiation to return and compensate white people for the land that they lost. And he's got to ensure that he's going to make electoral reforms. And those electoral reforms should culminate in an election that is going to be free and fair, and declared free and fair by the observation of American and...
I'm sorry, brother. We have a caller calling in. And caller, you can say where you're calling from as well.
Hotep, this is Sebek Ra. I'm calling from Miami, Florida, USA. I have a question. Thank you so much for all the information, Mr. Rutendo. I'm asking about what kind of calling is made right now for Africans at home and abroad. How can we make effort to invest in the situation in Zimbabwe?
Thank you, Sebek. Unfortunately, our governments are not making those kind of noises. And I remember doing a video where I was saying that any African nation with a political party that is not talking about Pan-Africanism, that is not recognizing our brothers and sisters in America, our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and the African diaspora as one with us, is irrelevant. So you ask a very good question. And what's happening is that we are having to work in our own private capacities to create investment vehicles, investment companies, and private equity companies that are going to start looking to reaching out to African Americans and bringing them in as investors into Africa. There are a number of African companies, black-owned African companies, that already come into Africa. One of my clients is actually an African American company that is a private equity company in South Africa. And what they're seeking to do is to bridge African opportunity with American finance. My only problem is that they're currently not race sensitive. In fact, they're looking for funding that's coming from Wall Street. And we're saying we want black private equity companies that are looking to talk to the African American that doesn't feel at home in America, that doesn't feel safe in America, that doesn't feel like they've got the same rights in America, like what Malcolm was saying at the beginning, to come home, invest their funds into developing a nation and a continent that will then be able to carry their interests in the future, and a continent that they can actually move to and develop.
Okay, well, thank you.
And then before I go, let me say this to Sebek. We understand when you read the statistics that African Americans only control 0.3% of the land in America. And now you need to, when we look at that as black Americans, as the people that worked that land for years, and people that actually have an intimate and emotional and probably spiritual attachment with that soil where they spilled their blood, it's only fitting for us to also say there's lots of land in places like Zimbabwe. There's lots of land in Africa that is being underutilized. 65% of South African land is not used. Yet we need to be growing food for the continent and the globe. Yet we need to stop receiving GMOs from America so that we can grow organic food that's good for our people. I would love to see more African Americans investing money into buying land in Africa and leveraging that land with savings and money that comes from the United States or from African Americans to grow food, good food, for our people here and in America.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your question, Sebek. And thank you so much, Brother Rutendo. I know that was presented in the video that you had on YouTube in terms of collective economic endeavors between Africans on the continent and here. We have another caller calling in from a 248 area code. Caller, can you tell us where you're calling from?
This is Rosa Campson calling from Michigan.
Hi,
How are
sister.
you all doing?
How are you? Welcome.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, Mugabe has a fairly significant group of supporters in Zimbabwe. And I'm just wondering, what are they doing and saying these days? And do they have any plans for the upcoming election in terms of putting forth a candidate that espouses Mugabe's ideology? And then the second question is, China and Zimbabwe had and have a relationship, an alliance. And Zimbabwe has been very interactive with the BRIC nations. And I know the United States is trying to lure Zimbabwe its way in terms of getting them to do what they want them to do. But on the other hand, I would imagine that China is also wooing Zimbabwe to get it to not move in the direction of the United States. What do you think will be the outcome in terms of the relationship between Zimbabwe and the BRIC nations, more specifically with China?
Wow, that's an amazing question. I love that question. So I'll start with the first question. There has been talk. So when you talk about the Mugabe aligned people, would have to be talking about G40. Now, a lot of the G40 members have either left the country or they're currently being pursued by legal action in the country. However, Mugabe's nephew was talking from outside the country saying that they are organizing, and they are organizing to be able to contest those elections. Whether that's going to be practical, we still have to wait and see. Whether that's going to be possible without any electoral reforms like the ones that the Americans are asking for still needs to be seen. But I hope you see the irony and the hypocrisy where Mugabe was never aligned with the United States, never had an ideology similar to that of the United States, but right now he needs Mnangagwa to follow U.S. instructions to create certain electoral reforms for him and his people to come back and contest those elections under free and fair conditions. I find that quite interesting. So it's a wait-and-see game for now, whether G40 is going to come back and contest the elections. Now, to the question of China, I have to say something that a lot of people are going to find incredible. I think China is a lame duck. Not only is China a lame duck, I actually think that China is a puppet and a lapdog of the United States. And the reason that is clear is that for anything to be happening in China right now, it's because of U.S. companies that are investing in China. They're the ones that are manufacturing in China. They're the ones whose intellectual property is being produced in China. I don't think that China is as independent as people want to think. Why am I convinced of this? I'm convinced of this because Zimbabwe went through 17 years of immense suffering. And the economy of Zimbabwe and the budget of Zimbabwe is just $4-5 billion. And the economy itself is just $16 billion. I don't understand why China could not be able to give Zimbabwe all the financial needs or the debt that she lost out from the IMF. And when China was going through its biggest expansion and building process, no chrome from Zimbabwe was exported to China. Now, I would like to understand why it is that during their building boom, they did not get supplies of chrome from Zimbabwe, which is supposed to be a partner country. Why did the country suffer so much? Why doesn't it have a currency? Why did it run out of foreign reserves? Because the Americans and the Europeans are not supporting Zimbabwe, but China is supposed to be supporting us. Where was China? In the same way, I can also say the same about BRICS. Where was BRICS? So to a certain extent, I met a banker that said anybody who thinks that BRICS is an alternative to the IMF is fooled, because BRICS is basically an IMF institution that is trying to hide under African nationalism, but to carry out the very same agenda.
Yeah, and I think that's where we are right now in this whole situation of waiting and seeing. exactly where people are going to place themselves in terms of those types of economic institutions, and if they are going to continue forward with the socialistic endeavors of Zanu that we saw unfold in the 80s and into the 90s. But we're gonna actually have to come to a close, and I wanted to just say to you, brother, if you can come back for a part 2, because we have other people who still want to ask some questions, and time has really gotten the best of us here. We have 3 minutes to close, and I'd like you to just maybe close out a little bit about your work that you're doing there, and also if you can come back for a part 2, we can get more into the ancestral aspect of this, which we talked about, and the necessity of the youth understanding their origin there, and how important that is for African people in general to connect to their ancestral origin, to be successful, as opposed to the Europeanized examples that we have been utilizing as it pertains to many different things. So if you can just close out, and then if you can join us for part 2, and by that time my fast will be over too.
Okay. My conclusion is basically that Africans need to start understanding that Africa is alone. The dependency on Asia, on China, on Russia, we have to get to a point where we recognize that all those nations do not have a vested interest in our nation. And the major reason why they don't have a vested interest in our nation, besides the economic self-interest, is the spiritual aspect.
Yes.
We are the original people. We are the people that have that connection and DNA that goes back to the Creator. Everybody else is a derivation from us. Every nation seems to know that except us. And every nation that knows that also doesn't want this nation to prosper. And the reason they don't want this nation to prosper is that for them to be where they are, they've had to align themselves with certain spiritual forces and spiritual entities that are not aligned to the spirit of what it is that created us. Now, on that understanding, Africans have got to start, therefore, understanding that what is within us spiritually is antithesis to what is in the Chinese, what is in the Japanese, what is in the American, what is in the European. We are different. We might be more aligned to the South Americans. We might be more aligned to the American Indian, much more than we are aligned to a lot of the people that we think we need to partner with. And how do we know that? All we need to do is look at the position of these other people in the world. You will see that they're at the bottom. And the reason that they're at the bottom is that the system, the spiritual system, the scientific system, and the system of economics that's prevailing right now is an anti-life system that all these other people who are at the bottom of the pyramid cannot relate to and cannot feed into. So I will continue to preach this message. I will continue to speak to people to awaken what it is that they are spiritually, because our spirits are tied to the universe, tied to the creation, and tied to the DNA of who we are. That's where the truth lies. It lies within us, and it lies with us connecting with who we are in our history, and we will start to get an answer as to which way we should be going and how we should do it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and we look forward to your joining us this coming week. Can you join us again next week?
Absolutely.
Okay, to continue this discussion. And if you'd like to reach out, you can reach out and contact me at the Bennu Ascension Institute at gmail.com. We have an online Ascension school that I'll be telling you about as we take this new journey together. And actually next week I'll be opening up talking about the Bennu Ascension Online Institute to give you some insight into this spiritual journey and the necessity of us connecting to our ancestral traditions. So thank you so much, Brother Rutendo, and we will start this journey again next week for part 2.
Let's go higher. I'm gonna touch the sky with my mind holding tight. Clouds passing by. Clouds passing by. I'm gonna touch the stars. It's not very far. There is no limit to how high I can consciousness. Let's go higher in our consciousness. Come